Many of you have come from out of town. Some friends and colleagues have come from overseas as well. So to all of you, welcome. Thank you very much for being here at the release of our first of the series of Janaagraha Brown India Initiative Citizenship Index findings. I'm not going to take up very much time, but just to introduce you to the larger context in which we do this at Janaagraha, and then hand over to my colleague Srikanth, who will then hand over to Ashu and Patrick and Siddharth and Katie. This is part of an initiative that began for us more than 5 years ago, and this is central to our larger work on improving quality of life in India's cities and towns. And our work is about both engaging with government as well as with citizens. And our grassroots work on the citizen front got us to think more seriously and systematically about saying, can we measure this? What does it mean? And there's a range of different questions that threw up. So through a process of inquiry over the years, this has been iterated many times, and many thanks to Ashu and Patrick and Siddharth who have taken it to the shape that you will see today. We call ourselves, we're not a think tank, Janaagraha and Jana in space. We call ourselves a do tank that thinks. So with that background, let me hand over to Srikanth.
Many of you are already aware of Janaagraha's work, but this marks a very important milestone in Janaagraha's journey of the last 14 years. Janaagraha's mission is to transform quality of life in India's cities and towns, and we define quality of life to mean quality of infrastructure and services and quality of citizenship. By quality of citizenship, we mean not just the relationship between citizens and the state, but also the relationship that citizens feel they share among themselves. A lot of the efforts in the development sector in urban in general and also within Janaagraha have been focused on what we call the supply side. How do we improve the quality of infrastructure and services? However, in a democratic setup, especially at the level of a city, which represents the grassroots of democracy, we believe quality of citizenship is an equal aspect of quality of life. About 4 years back, we started thinking about how to measure the nature and extent of citizenship in India's cities. Not least because while public discourse is focused quite extensively on state of citizenship and aspects of citizenship in rural India, we thought not much has been discussed and spoken about or written about in urban India. And this is clearly reflected in the nature and extent of decentralization and devolution of powers and the nature and extent of citizen participation that we see in cities. This has been a journey of over 3 years with our partners, Brown India Initiative, led by Ashu, Patrick and Siddharth. We ran one of India's, what I'm given to understand is one of India's largest urban surveys, covering more than 4,000 samples in Bangalore. It took us more than 2 years to have that executed. We held a workshop specifically with academics and researchers earlier this year in March in Delhi to invite criticisms on our approach, on our methodology and on our draft findings. And between March and now, we've sort of finalized this, we've sort of wrapped up this phase of our work on what we call Janaagraha Brown Citizenship Index. We believe this is only the first milestone in a far much longer journey, which of course the proof of which will lie in us creating institutions that facilitate citizen participation in India's cities, thus sort of fructifying the dream of democracy in the cities in India. Let me quickly walk you through the agenda for the day. Our first panel, which will begin right now, will be a presentation of the key report. Yeah, everybody, sorry.
This sheet is
the agenda is in your kits. Ashu, Patrick and Siddharth will present the findings of the report in a bit right now, which will be followed by a fairly open discussion where we would encourage all of you to participate on the findings themselves. We'll invite comments from all of you and discussions. We will then break briefly and we will reconvene for the first of the 3 panels. The first panel will be on Does Citizenship Matter to the Urban Poor, which will be chaired by Dr. Patrick Heller, which will have Partha Mukhopadhyaya, Sudhir Krishnaswamy and Narendra Pani as panelists. We will then break for lunch, and at 2 o'clock we will convene for the second panel on area sabhas, which will have Ramesh, Dr. Shalini Rajneesh and Dr. Jessica Sedin. At 3 o'clock we will have the panel on citizen participation in Indian cities, a reality check, which will have Dr. Sandeep Shastri, Dr. Renu Khosla, Dr. Manisha Priya. And those are the 3 critical panels for today. With that, let me hand over to Ashu, Patrick and Siddharth.
So at each step in the evolution of this work, there has been back and forth between practitioners and researchers. Bangalore survey is completed. A project report is in your kit. Now this report is to be turned into 2-3 academic papers by this summer. And the overall plans, as Shrikant briefly mentioned, include covering many cities of India. And the Bangalore experience of our research would be the foundation of our further research. The aim of the project is to construct a citizenship index. We have been partially successful in that, as you will see in a moment, not wholly. And we would like to be wholly successful, but that's an intellectual matter. And second, examination of basic service delivery, power, sanitation, water, and roads. Now, what determines how these services are delivered to India's urban citizens, and how does citizenship matter relative to caste, class, and religion? Please note that caste, class, and religion have often been used as the building blocks for an examination of public service delivery. We are throwing in another variable here, citizenship, and examining it in relation to the traditionally identified variables, which are typically caste, class, and religion. Now, here's some conceptual background. We are researchers, so what we do has some basis in previous scholarship. So historically, citizenship and exclusion have been two dominant themes in the study of urban politics all over the world. It is generally believed that sooner or later the city is where subjects become citizens, meaning human beings who have come to understand that they have a bundle of rights, that such rights are not an expression of government kindness, and the rights are entitlements. So the notion of rights-bearing individuals, the claim of the theory is, typically emerges in an urban setting, though as Patrick's previous work argued that notions of citizenship had emerged in Kerala countryside as well, not simply in cities. So while this is generally true, this is not a claim that we can make without reservations. Generally true. Alongside, some intermediate forms have also accompanied the rise of cities. The late 19th century US saw not only the emergence of cities in a primarily rural society after the Civil War ended, let's say 1865, America was about 30% urban, if that, and by 1900, 1910, depending on how you cut the data, it was 50% urban. So that's the period when cities emerge in a big way, and urbanization accelerates in the US history. That period is very well studied. You not only had rise of citizenship consciousness, but you also had machine politics. In exchange for votes, migrants got access to services. City politics in the late 19th century United States became very corrupt. Moreover, the American South saw the rise of exclusionary Jim Crow politics and laws. So both citizenship and exclusion simultaneously rising in different spheres in an urbanizing America. What's the story? What do we know about urbanization in Europe? The European urban narrative is not simply one of an uninterrupted march towards equal citizenship. During the 20th century, Europe was also a site of vicious forms of racial and ethnic discrimination and violence. Ashish Nandi argues that the first half of the 20th century was perhaps the most violent period in human history. I think it's very hard to prove that with statistical exactitude, but the point may well be right. During the 20th century, Europe was a site of vicious forms of racial and ethnic discrimination and violence. Some groups were systematically deprived of citizenship rights. Modern-day Western Europe may have qualitatively moved away from the violently exclusionary realities of the first half of the 20th century, but pockets of citizenship deficits remain, as they do in contemporary United States. On the whole, if you were to summarize this century and a half long history of Western Europe and the United States of America, you would argue that exclusion has not entirely disappeared, though many more steps towards citizenship consciousness, citizenship rights have been taken. So declining exclusion, but not disappearing exclusion. India's urbanization. Now, so what will be India's mix of citizenship and exclusion as we urbanize? So here's some standard data about India's cities and urban population. In 1951, India was a mere 17.3% urban. Only 5 Indian cities had populations greater than 1 million. By 2011, 3 cities, Mumbai, Delhi, and Kolkata, had more than 10 million people each, and 53 cities had populations of more than 1 million each. And depending on what measures are used, India's population, 32% in 2011, could well be over 40% over the next 15 to 20 years. There is a standard McKinsey proposal about that, statistical prediction about that, a statistical prediction that Partho, who will comment a little later, Partho Mukhopadhyay challenges, Partho believes that India is more urban than either the census or McKinsey would concede. And you'll hear some of that a little later. The latest census shows that for the first time, the absolute increase in urban population, that is during 2001 and 2011, exceeded the increase in rural population in any 10-year period since independence, could be any 10-year period in the modern history of India. And it is generally believed that once that happens, an urban acceleration sets in. So it's quite likely that 2011 to 2021, once again, many more people will be added to cities in all kinds of ways, or India will be, many more people will be added to India's cities than to India's villages. And if this continues, of course, this is a sign of a rapidly urbanizing society, much like late 19th century America. Unsurprisingly, governance of cities is now becoming a big issue. Agriculture accounts for less than 15% of GDP. It could have dropped to 12% by now. Urban India has become and will continue to be the primary source of India's economic growth, and it will also have many more people. Given the heavily rural nature of post-independence India, political, sociological, and economic research was heavily focused, was concentrated on rural issues. It is now time to add a new urban angle to the predominantly rural gaze of Indian scholarship and also identify its policy and practical implications. You can also perhaps argue that roughly within the next 10 years, urban issues will become important in national politics. Also, India's national politics was heavily rurally driven and has been for the last 60 years. Very clearly, because India is still 68% rural, according to the census. Now, some theoretical remarks about citizenship and how we have modified the conventional tale. So the conventional tale comes from a classic written by a former LSE professor, T.H. Marshall, and the book was Citizenship and Social Class, 1950. And the core idea was that modern societies do not have subjects, they have citizens, though in British parlance they are still called queen subjects, but they're really citizens now. They might be nominally referred to or formally referred to as queen subjects. Subjects receive services as a favor by the rulers, citizens as a matter of rights. And he proposed a three-dimensional concept. Citizenship had a civil component, which the freedoms, rising freedoms, and associations captured, a political component that voting captured, and a social component that that public policy aimed at addressing deprivation captured. So rise of welfare state was the social side of citizenship. Our main critique is, and here we follow Margaret Somers, a sociologist at the University of Michigan. We accept her criticism that Marshall conflated rights as status with rights as practice. So following Somers then, we propose a relational view and distinguish between the status of citizenship, which is a bundle of rights, and the practice of citizenship, which is a set of relationships the citizens have with respect to one another and vis-a-vis the state. We are more interested in the practice of citizenship than simply the legal side of it. Now, Marshallian political and civil rights were made available to citizens of India in 1952, in 1950 by the Constitution. But social rights, right to food, right to education, right to health regardless of income, were not. Rights to food and education have very recently been instituted as rights, but there is no right to health yet. How then one translate the idea of social rights in Marshall to the Indian context? And here we use Amartya Sen to make our move, conceptual move. We argue that we should focus on basic public services and infrastructure. Basic services and infrastructure, water, electricity, sanitation, and roads are critical in their own right and can be said to constitute a core set of capabilities in Amartya Sen's sense of the term. These capabilities are one of the obvious advantages that cities have over rural areas and can be measured much more precisely than education and health. We'll give you some interesting data on education and health. For example, how many citizens of Bangalore now what proportion depends on public hospitals and public schools? And the data the overall conclusion will not surprise you, but the magnitude might. We don't know. Let's see. Once we reconceptualize citizenship this way, in a practice-oriented way, we propose that it ought to have three components. These are not Marshallian components, these are components based on a critique of Marshall. First, it requires having sufficient knowledge and understanding to fully engage in public life. Second, one must enjoy the full freedom to participate in public life. This cannot simply be confined to voting, which has been the main of a rather obsessive project of political science, the emphasis on voting. We say voting is extremely important, but citizenship cannot be confined to voting. It means enjoying full freedom to engage in activities of public relevance across social boundaries, even between elections. Third, one has to be able to engage the state as a bearer of rights, not as a supplicant, client, or subject. This means both being able to actually find and engage with the state and being able to do so without having to pay a bribe, call in favors, mobilize personal networks. Do you directly access the state? Do you directly access the state without intermediaries, without bribes, is a very important test of citizenship. These three components of citizenship, knowledge, participation, and engagement, are the building blocks of the idea or the concept of citizenship we have developed for this project, and we will give you now the findings and then detailed statistical analysis later. For the Bangalore study, our findings are: 1. Bangaloreans vote a lot, but between elections their participation rates are not as high. 8% to 12%, but 70% voting. 8% to 12% participation in activities that will list for you between elections. But what level of non-electoral participation should be considered high remains unclear, and whether Bangaloreans participate in public life between elections more or less than other cities will only become clear when we get to other cities, right? So, but the idea that Bangaloreans vote a lot and do not participate in public life between elections all that much, whether it is slow or high, we don't know yet. All that much, that is consistent with the national picture. Second, Bangaloreans have more vertical than horizontal citizenship. Vertical citizenship is a Weberian idea, relationship of citizens with the state. And horizontal citizenship is a Tocquevillian idea, relationship among citizens. So Bangaloreans have more vertical citizenship than horizontal citizenship. They would like to be treated equally by the state, but many fewer would like to treat fellow citizens equally. This, and we'll give you the numbers on this, they're very striking. To be treated equally by the state, but a certain unwillingness to treat other citizens equally. So greater verticality than horizontality. 3, while Bangaloreans know their formal rights, their capacity to use those rights, which we call effective citizenship, is very unevenly distributed. The biggest predictors of high effective citizenship are education and class. Caste and religion also impact citizenship. Scheduled castes and Muslims generally have lower levels of citizenship, but the Muslim story is slightly complicated, as we'll see in a moment. And it's a bit of a surprise for at least those of us who did not know Bangalore very well. You'll see that Muslims are much more integrated in Bangalore's life than would be true, perhaps we'll see, in Delhi or Mumbai. Fourth, unequal citizenship is largely driven by differences in knowledge of civic and political affairs. Participation in contrast, is 11. Lower classes, SCs, STs, and Muslims participate more than higher classes, lower classes more than higher classes, SCs and STs more than higher castes, Muslims more than Hindus. And there's some data on Christians also, which we'll present to you. On social citizenship, which we are defining not in a Marshallian sense, which we're defining as access to basic services and infrastructure, water, sanitation, electricity, and roads, is highly correlated with class and caste, though not with religion. Muslims do not suffer, relatively, right, speaking, when it comes to access to basic services, which is a very surprising result to me, but now that I've read more about Bangalore, it's not so surprising. And sixth, though, and this is perhaps our biggest finding, and I hope this will receive adequate commentary, though the poor have less effective citizenship, it matters more to them. The poor get more basic services and infrastructure from the citizenship they do have than their class position would otherwise predict. To put it simply, if they did not participate in political and civic life, they would receive less from the state. Citizenship, in this sense, is an ally of the poor, or citizenship abates class. That argument, this conclusion is consistent with Marshall's claim about Britain and Europe in general, that citizenship abates class. That is one way in which the poor get access to services. So now, this was my part of the presentation. I hand you over to Patrick Heller, my colleague Patrick now will run you through the data. This is for all of us.
Yeah, run is the operative word. Run and talk fast because there's a lot of data, but I need to use this, right?
Yeah.
I just want to begin, though, by thanking Ramesh and Swati. Without them, this project would have never happened. And this was an enormous data collection process. It's 4,000 households, but you have to realize that the instrument had 250 questions in it. We got a little crazy. You know, when you put a lot of people on a project, everyone has their pet questions, and this was a bit the kitchen sink approach. We really didn't know how to measure citizenship, so we figured we'd ask every imaginable question and try to capture this thing called citizenship. We're only to show you a very small part of the actual report. But none of this data collection could have happened without the help of the entire Janaagraha team, and in particular Ebony Baratelli, who unfortunately can't be with us today, who is really the person who took care of all the operational details of running the survey itself, and then Katie Pyle, who's taken over from Ebony. And if you've got a wonderful report in front of you, you can thank Katie, because what we sent her looked very, very different. I'm going to summarize with this chart what Ashu's just taken you through, namely our way of conceptualizing citizenship. So we have really two dimensions, this idea of effective citizenship. That is, you know, Indians are constitutionally empowered and they have rights, but the question is, how do you use your rights? How do you actually practice citizenship? That's what we call effective citizenship. And that's intrinsically important. Irrespective of what citizenship actually gets you, we would agree with Mark just said, and having capabilities, having citizenship in particular is intrinsically important, but it can also be instrumentally important. That is, having effective rights and using those rights can translate into substantive outcomes, material outcomes, and that's what, via Marshall, we call social citizenship. So the way we've operationalized this is to argue that, you know, if we want to measure whether effective citizenship drives social citizenship, but we recognize, of course, that that's a complicated relationship that will be mediated by religion, caste, class, education, gender, migrant status, location in the city. We didn't put it there, but we actually measure for that as well. And then very quickly, and you have the report, and the appendix is detailed and gives you all the questions and shows you how we constructed these different components. But just very quickly, for us, effective citizenship has three components: the knowledge component, and we have both a political dimension, knowledge of political life, who your elected representatives are, etc. A civic component, which agencies deliver what services, where do you take a complaint, etc. And then we have three different components for participation: the traditional electoral participation, that's the easiest to measure; political participation, that is non-electoral participation between election campaigns, so being active in party affairs, etc. And then civic activity, joining associations, being active in the community. And each of these is measured with a number of different questions. And then the third dimension, this is, I should say, fairly conventional. Most studies of citizenship, people look at knowledge and they look at political participation. I think what we've really added to this is this third dimension of engagement. And this is the idea, as Ashu just summarized, that citizens have to be able to engage with the state as bearers of rights, not as supplicants, not as clients, not as beggars, but as people who go to the state saying, I have a right to X, and I pay my taxes, and now please be a good public servant and treat me as a citizen. Turns out this is really, really hard to measure. But it turns out we got some great data on it. For technical reasons, we couldn't put it in the index, and maybe in the Q&A we can address that. But we will report some of the findings because they're really interesting. The other index that we develop in this project is what we call the BSDII index, which is Basic Service Delivery and Infrastructure Index. And we wanted to focus on things that we felt confident we could measure. So we have water, we have sanitation, we have electricity, we have roads. These are all capability enhancing. So they're good indicators to try and measure. And we try to do something a little different than the standard census data. We try to measure not just whether or not you have this service, but what the quality of the service is. So we have questions about where it's sourced from, how usable is it, how convenient is it, are there supply gaps, is the supply itself consistent, etc. So this is the basic framework, and now I'm going to literally run you through a bunch of crosstabs, which I think is the most intuitive way of trying to understand the data. But I should tell you immediately, and then Siddharth will elaborate on this, that every crosstab we're showing you is statistically significant. That is, we're just showing you 2x2s, class by citizenship or gender by participation. But in the models, it turns out that everything we're showing you is, when you control for the effects of all the other variables that we have in here, everything is significant. So very quickly, sampling strategy, we picked 20 wards at random, though we stratified in order to capture a larger share of Muslims and SCSTs. We didn't want to undersample those communities. We picked 200 polling parts, mapped these out, and then from the polling parts, in each polling part, anywhere from 15 to 30 households were surveyed, giving us a total sample of 4,093. These are the basic demographics. I'm not going to say much here. We were thrilled that we got 18% Muslims. The census tells us it's 14%, so we oversampled just as we intended to. Likewise with SCs, STs, we slightly oversampled, which is exactly what we're trying to do. And then you've got the breakdown of education. So, we suspect class is an important driver of citizenship and service delivery. So we wanted to measure class. Class is a notoriously difficult concept to measure. The use of the term middle class, to me, is one of the most obfuscating and silly usages of the class concept, and so we have to disaggregate it. But we have 3 different measures. We have an asset measure, so we ask people, what assets do you have in your household? We've got occupational data, the chief wage earner, what does he or she do? And then we have housing type. And housing type turns out to be really critical. In our story, it's the measure of class that we're going to use through the rest of the presentation. Housing type, if you look in the appendix of the report, you'll see we have pictures and descriptions, but this is essentially a range that goes from informal settlements to upper class housing. And this is the enumerators themselves, not the respondents, who identify the housing type. And just a quick point here is that, I don't have a pointer unfortunately, but asset range, it's a bit lumpy, so I don't want to go into details of what this is, but the distribution, basically 2 and 3, that's where it's all clustered, so it's not telling us a whole lot. Occupational structure is pretty much what you'd expect. A lot of white-collar workers, 44% in total, and Parto will be thrilled to learn, or he already knew this, but this confirms arguments he's made before, that Bangalore has a real working class, right? There's a lot of people out there who are workers. Not everyone's a white-collar worker. And then under housing type, and it's circled, so he doesn't have to point anymore, and the red number, so 52.7% of our sample live in HT3s, housing type 3, which we're calling lower middle class, right? And there, again, there's pictures in the report if you're interested in what an HT3 looks like. And this is, sorry?
The next slide is the picture.
Yeah, and this is a really, this is a big number, right? And a bit of a problem because a big chunk of our samples falling into this category. So it looks like Bangalore is as the standard narrative about Bangalore suggests, it's a big middle-class city. Over 50% live in the same kind of housing. Moreover, when you start running the crosstabs, what you find is that it looks like it's a big middle class, and that middle class in caste and religious terms is quite integrated. So if you look at the circled part, these are rows, so the row adds up to 100%. And what it's telling you is the distribution of a particular caste community across the different housing types. And, it looks like an awful lot of SC, a big chunk of the SC/ST community lives in lower middle class housing, right? And next slide is religion, or community, and Muslims, a huge percentage, 63% of Muslims live in HT3, in lower middle class housing. So, it looks like we've got a big middle class and it's socially integrated. Well, the problem here is that number is too big. 52 is just too lumpy. We would imagine, and some of our field visits confirm this point, that there's a lot of heterogeneity in this category called HT3. So fortunately, we're able to disaggregate. And this is a little complicated, but bear with me because the results here are crucial to our larger findings. So here you see an average polling part as we mapped it out. This is what we construe as a typical HT3. It turns out we collected not just the housing type of the household that we surveyed, the sampled household. The teams also collected the housing types of every unit, every housing unit in that polling part. So we have, if you will, a full census of housing types in every neighborhood. And this allows us to figure out the people who live in HT3s, what kind of neighborhood do they live in? Because neighborhoods are important, both for citizenship and service delivery. So again, let me apologize, it's a little bit complicated, but we have this reclassification rule. And here what we essentially did is we said, look, if an HT3, a surveyed household that has a housing type 3, is in a neighborhood where the other households are 70% or less HT3, we're going to reclassify it. Because it looks like that's a mixed neighborhood, in fact. So we shouldn't be calling it an HT3 neighborhood. And the rule was quite simple. If the balance of houses that are not HT3 are HT4s, they're higher up the class scale, then we'll reclassify it as a 3.5. And if they're lower down, we'll reclassify it as a 2.5. And the key here, we're going to focus on the 2.5. A typical 2.5 neighborhood is basically you have a lot of HT3s, but you've got something below that. It could be shacks, it could be slums, right? So it's a different kind of neighborhood than living in a polling part that's all HT3s or HT4s, right? And then this allows us to start disaggregating. And what we find, and I should explain the heading, in the sociological literature, we make a distinction between what are called ethnic enclaves and ghettos. So in both, you have a concentration of a particular community. An enclave is a place where people want to live because there's community resources, cultural networks, a lot of social capital, there's a temple or a mosque. You have reasons to want to live there. A ghetto, which comes out of the US literature on race, is a place where you are stuck and you can't get out either because you don't have the financial means to get out, or you can't get out because of discriminatory policies or other mechanisms of social exclusion. So either both has a concentration of a particular group, but in sociological terms are very different. So we're trying to figure out now, these ghettos are ethnic enclaves. If you look at Muslims, all of a sudden that big, remember 63% were in HT3s. When you start disaggregating it, well, it turns out HT3 Muslims, a lot of Muslims who live in an HT3 house live in a 2.5 neighborhood. In other words, they live in a community that has a lot of shacks, or is a quasi, so we're calling it a quasi-slum. Right? So you're living in a quasi-slum. And likewise, SC/ST, you'll recall, I think it was above 50% lived in HT3 housing, but a big chunk of those, 20%, live in 2.5 neighborhoods. So already we're beginning to see some differentiation here. And the key are these 2 points at the bottom, which I hope you can read. If you just add up the numbers, 48% of SCs, STs live in either informal settlements, designated slums, or quasi-slums. Right? So that's half the community, compared to only 16% for OBCs or 12% for FCs. Right? So the ratio difference is huge there. It's 4 and 3 respectively, which clearly means there's a concentration of SCs, STs in particular kinds of neighborhoods. Muslims, 36% live in these poor neighborhoods, i.e. 1, 2, or 2.5, versus 25% for Hindus. There's a difference, but not as large. Right? So it's beginning to look like STs live in ghettos and Muslims live in ethnic enclaves, although we can't confirm that until we look at the service delivery data. I'm going to skip this. It's a little bit confusing. The big point, though, is that the predominant group in informal settlements and slums, not surprisingly, are STs. There's actually not that many Muslims living in informal settlements and designated slums, but in your 2.5 neighborhoods, what we're calling quasi-slums, the vast majority of people are either Muslims or STs, 58 by our calculation. All right. This is on a somewhat different register, and Ashu already made reference to this. We asked all our respondents, what do you think are the most important responsibilities of citizenship? And the numbers are quite striking here. These are percentages. So 72%, and again 72% said voting and respecting the law are the most important responsibilities of citizenship, as they are. But this is what we call the vertical dimension of citizenship, right? You have a commitment to behaving in ways that are in conformity with what the state wants, or the Constitution wants. You must interact with the state as a voter, interact with the state as someone who respects the law, which is terrific. We want that. But you could also argue that citizenship, in the Tocquevillian sense, is about treating others as your equals, as rights bearers. And it's only 40% who think that's a really important responsibility of citizenship. And then civic involvement. Again, de Tocqueville, many other sociologists have argued that the real essence of citizenship is being involved in your community. Well, only 6% think that's important. Right? And these last two, for us, are what we call the horizontal dimension of citizenship. Right? Thinking of the other as a rights-bearing citizen and someone that you want to engage with civically, etc. So this is a bit of an aside, but an interesting one. All right, this is our engagement measure, and this was a total of over 60 questions. We didn't ask people what their engagement with the state was, because we were afraid that they would Hawthorne effect, etc., etc. So we asked them instead about their experiences of engaging with the state. And we asked about 9 different services, so electricity, water, roads, etc., going to public hospitals or schools, and we asked about getting different cards, BPL, ration card, caste card, etc. For cards, we asked over a 10-year period, so the question was, in the last 10 years, have you gone for a card, etc. For all the services, it was over the last 2 years, and this is a household level question. And our presumption was, in the last 10 years for cards, in the last 2 years for a whole range of services, everyone must have had to engage with the state at some point. And our running joke was that even in Switzerland, I'm from Switzerland, that's relatively well governed and prosperous, everyone goes to the state at least once in this period for these kinds of services. And what we found was, and maybe you're not surprised by this, but we were, 23% of our households have never gone to the state for a service in the last 2 years or for a card in the last 10 years. And bearing in mind that service quality delivery is not very high, as you'll see in a moment, right? So people have all sorts of problems with their services, but they're not going to the state. At least not at all. So this group is not going at all. Of those who do go, 63% engage directly, and 14% use an intermediary. Right? And for us, using an intermediary is a bit of a complication, because in principle, you should be able to go as a rights-bearing citizen. You shouldn't need an intermediary. And then of the 77% who did engage with the state, 27% paid a bribe and 73 did not. And this is probably a fairly significant underestimation. People are a bit reluctant to directly report paying bribes. Engaging the state by housing type. So we're back to our housing type. This is our proxy for class. And you'll note the first circle, informal settlements. Again, not surprising, but telling nonetheless. 50% haven't engaged with the state at all. They're invisible to the state. They're out of the system. Right? I mean, they're literally on the periphery, socially excluded. But the other extreme is really interesting. So I should explain, none is you don't engage at all. Poor quality is you engage either through an intermediary or by paying a bribe. And then good quality is you went and you had a problem and they addressed that problem and they treated you as a rights-bearing citizen. So the good news is that there's actually a lot of good quality, but there's a lot of poor quality as well. What's really astonishing is that the group that reports the most poor quality and remember this is using an intermediary or paying a bribe, are the upper class. And you know, the interpretation here I think is relatively straightforward. The upper class don't need to use their rights. They'll call someone, they'll pay someone, they'll send the driver, they've got social networks. They're subverting citizenship. They don't need it, so they go around it. And it's a quite striking finding for us. Who depends on public schools and hospitals? And again, Ashu referenced this. And I work a lot on Brazil and South Africa. In Brazil and South Africa, you go to townships or informal settlements, anywhere from 90 to 95% of the population in those areas depends on public institutions for accessing health and education. In Bangalore, for shacks, it's 41%. In other words, and the way this was asked, if they're not using public, they're using private. Right? So this just gives you a sense of just how big the private delivery of what are traditionally public goods has become in the Bangalore context. Even in slums, only 36% use both public schools and public hospitals. And by the time you get to the upper class, they've completely abdicated. Right? I mean, they're out of the system altogether. Right? They don't need public institutions, and they don't use them. Okay, moving on to the Citizenship Index, and being cognizant of the fact that I'm running out of time. I'm going to go through the knowledge component and the participation component, and then give you the overall scores. This is, again, there's 12 knowledge questions, there's 9 participation questions. I'll highlight on participation, 72% vote. This was Ashu's opening point. 10% are politically active. Between voting, 12% participate in associations. Is that high? Is that low? Really hard to tell. I don't think anyone else has data like this for the rest of India. There have been other estimates, but we're a little wary of reporting them. But 93% don't know about ward committees. Right? So all these efforts to decentralize, to have local participatory involvement, only 7% of the population is even aware that these are legally mandated, etc. All right, so knowledge across groups. So again, this is an aggregate of the questions that we asked, the 12 questions we asked. And as you can see, there's a gradient everywhere. So Muslims have less knowledge than Hindus. SCSTs, less than OBCs, and others being forward caste, and it's a steep gradient. And then when you come to class, it's a very steep gradient. So people in shacks have almost no knowledge of the city. In the middle class, they have a lot, and then it drops off for the upper class. And again, the upper class has the luxury of not knowing. Right? They don't need to know this stuff. Participation, now immediately if you toggle back and forth, what's interesting about participation is it's much flatter. Right? Knowledge is steeply differentiated across groups and across class. Participation much less so. Muslims participate as much as, more than Hindus and as much as Christians. SCs, STs participate more than OBCs and others. And then when you get to classes, you get a gradient with the lower middle class participating more than slums, but then a drop off again. In the States, when we learned that George Bush had been spying on everyone through the NSA, I had a friend who started a bumper sticker, and he said, I wasn't using my civil rights anyways, right? And that's a bit what's happening with the middle and the upper class, right? They don't really need them, so they don't participate so much. We threw this in at the last moment because this is really interesting, and it underscores the point that knowledge differentiates, participation levels. And look at the gender scores. So this is, on knowledge, the gap between women and men is huge. So this is low, women at 64, compared to only 45% for men. Big gap, and then that gap's reproduced at the high level of knowledge. Then participation, the gap disappears. Right, so women basically participate as much as men do. So participation is the level. It's the equalizer. So citizen, now if you aggregate the participation and the knowledge measures into the larger index, these are the overall scores. And again, all three have gradients. The gradient's not as pronounced for communities and for caste as it is for class, but it's pronounced everywhere. And again, with this big drop off at the very end for the upper class. So this is our big index, the CI index. This is the overall distribution. Siddharth will tell you a lot more about just how meaningful this is in a moment. Now I'm turning to our social rights dimension of citizenship. This is what kind of services are these households getting. And again, I'm pressed for time, so I won't go into details, but these are, we identified 6 different levels of service provisioning, and we classify 3 as poor services and 2 and 1 as very poor services. So 3 basically means you may have roads, but during the monsoon they might get washed out, or you've got drainage problems. It means you get water, but it may be hard to access sometimes, and you don't have storage capacity. You get electricity, but there's a lot of power cuts. So we think we can call that a poor level of service delivery. 4 through 6 are fairly good, 6 being extremely good. And this is the overall distribution. And the big point being here that 30% of households in our sample have either poor or very poor levels of basic service delivery. 37. And again, this is the same index reported by housing type or by class, if you will. And the big finding here, I won't go through the details, is that 82% of informal settlements have, are in the bottom 3, so very poor poor services. 67% in designated slums, and in our new disaggregated category, the quasi-slum, almost 50% have poor services. Okay, and I'm almost done, but this is a very
I can just contrast that with the other end of the class.
Sorry.
We just contrast that with
the
upper class.
Yeah, and it becomes very clear in the graph. So the upper class is, it's all concentrated. You'll note that even for the upper class, it's the middle class that has the highest level of 6 best service level delivery. And the upper, this is probably because people have moved out into the periphery and build villas or farms, as they call them, in Delhi, and they're not that well serviced by the local state, but they're serviced in other ways.
Roughly 84% of the upper classes have not the highest, but very high level of service.
And that becomes very clear here. So the gradients here, are, so again, this is the percentage of people who have low BSDI fall into those lower 1, 2, 3 categories. By community, Hindu, Muslim, Christian, flat. So Muslims, we can now say, live in concentrated areas as a group, but their service levels are pretty much equal to other groups. So we think this means it's an ethnic enclave. Now, without qualitative work, we should be careful about making that assertion, but when you get to SCST, you see the difference is huge between SCSTs and OBCs. So for us, this means these are ghettos. They're concentrated as communities into neighborhoods, specific spatial zones, areas, etc. And in those areas, they have poor levels of service delivery. So it's a ghetto. It's not someplace people would really want to live. And then the class effect is massive, right? And it's a perfect gradient. This is a sociologist's, dream. I mean, we always say there's 3 variables that we're interested in: class, class, and class. And in this instance, it turned out that was indeed the variable that was of greatest interest. Now, I should say immediately, we're not measuring class, we're measuring housing type, which is not necessarily, it's a good proxy, we think it's a good proxy, but housing type could reflect the nature of the settlement you live in, it could reflect the role of the public sector in distributing subsidized housing, it could reflect a lot of things. So we are doing a whole new set of data work looking at what we call neighborhood effects to sort of tease this out, but clearly there's a very strong class effect. And now we're going to get to the statistical punchline of all this, and I'm going to hand this over to Siddharth.
The next 2 slides might be harder to read here. They're in your kit.
The handouts.
The handouts you can read greatly.
Here, these handouts basically summarize the results of the statistical exercises we've undertaken. So the cross tabs give us a sense of how the relationships might look. But as Patrick noted, we don't control, so one relationship is not controlling, is not presented controlling for the effect of other variables. So in order to explore these relationships more systematically, we estimate a series of regression models, and some of these results are presented here. And all of them are presented in the handout, in the handbook that you have. So in these models, the dependent variable is social citizenship, which is the infrastructure and service delivery index. And we have a variety of independent variables, including caste, class, that is the housing type, education, we have religion, we have citizenship, which is of course our most important independent variable, We have whether the house was in an inner ward or in an outer ward, that is the inner and outer areas, and whether the respondent was a migrant or a non-migrant. One other point I'd like to make is that most of the crosstabs that you saw were categorical variables. So basically we identified the mean values of our, well, let me backtrack. All the variables we use in this, at least the key variables, service, delivery and infrastructure index, as well as the citizenship index are continuous measures. But in the crosstabs, for ease of explanation, we kind of divided it into ranges, sometimes using the mean, sometimes just defining a particular range of, let's say, from 0 to 0.2, 0.2 to 0.4, and then the service BSDII, the service infrastructure index, then gets values of 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 6. So the crosstabs, if you see values of 1 through 6, that's what it is. So we kind of divided it up or set it up as a categorical variable for ease of explanation. But here, in these models, our key independent variable, the key independent variable, which is citizenship index, and the dependent variable, which is the service delivery and infrastructure index, are continuous variables. And the other variables are coded as 0, 1, which is typically referred to as a dummy variable. So this summarizes the basic results that we get from our regression models. So housing type captures class, so we find that typically housing types 1, which is informal settlement, housing type 2, which is a designated slum type housing, receive typically lower levels of services and infrastructure compared to housing type 3, which becomes our reference category in these regression models, and housing type 4, which is upper, and housing type 5, which is typically seen as standalone houses. They have much higher levels of infrastructure in both the models or in the entire sample, which has, and the Hindu sample only, which captures the SC/ST distinctions. We find that, again, Muslim households don't indicate any higher levels or lower levels of infrastructure and services compared to other non-Muslim households. With the caste, we find that SC/ST households have or show lower levels of infrastructure and service delivery. Education, if the respondent or the chief wage earner of the household had higher levels of education, specifically secondary school or college and above, then these households were characterized by higher levels of infrastructure. Migrant status doesn't play a role, whereas what we don't have here is inner, outer. We also find that households in outer wards are characterized by lower levels of service delivery and infrastructure. And unfortunately, we find that our citizenship variable does not have unconditional effects on service delivery. So basically what we're saying is unconditionally, citizenship does not have an impact on service delivery. But what we do find are conditional effects. So what this means is that does citizenship have differential effects for the rich and the poor? So we test four hypotheses here. We try to see if citizenship has differential effects for the rich and the poor. That's one hypothesis. For Dalit versus non-Dalit households, that's the second hypothesis. For Muslim versus non-Muslim households, the third hypothesis. And for the illiterate versus educated households, that is where the chief wage earners or the respondents were educated or not, illiterate or had some levels of education. Okay. So, oh. So the next slide is going to be again your handout, and this kind of summarizes, well, this presents the results of all our part of the estimations, and we only show the conditional effects of citizenship controlling for all other variables. The one before this. So note that the ones marked in yellow represent the conditional effects, and this is the way it's included in the model is as a multiplicative interaction term between household and citizenship. Here, house represents the housing category, so it's coded 1 if housing types are 1 and 2, 0 otherwise, because we are interested in the very poor. So that becomes our interest category. And we find that for the very poor households, that is household levels 1 and 2, an increase in citizenship or higher levels of citizenship tends to bring them higher levels of services compared to those households with lower levels of citizenship among the poor. For the rich, it makes no difference. Whether you have high or low levels of citizenship, doesn't make a difference whether you receive services or not. That is determined by the class type, the housing type. Okay. We find a similar relationship for Dalit households. We find that for Dalit and Muslim households, we don't find these effects. For literate, non-literate, we find these effects of a conditional effect of citizenship. So if you're an illiterate household, then an increase or a higher level of citizenship in that household brings you a higher level of services relative to a same type of a household which does not have the same level of citizenship.
And just one more addition here. Those who know stats here would see that in no time, but those who don't, the 3 stars essentially mean that there's only 1% chance that this result is wrong. 2 stars would mean 5% chance, and 3 stars would mean 10% chance. 3 stars is that's a dream result. Only 1% chance that this relationship is wrong. That is to say, very high probability here that citizenship, when combined with poverty, gets you more than it would otherwise.
So the next is basically summarizes the these interaction terms, and Ashu, would you?
So to conclude then, when it comes to simply the distribution of citizenship, then the urban poor, Muslims, SCs and STs have less of it. And a lot of this is driven by lack of knowledge, could be lack of education. Civil society activists, organizations such as Janaagraha can play a very big role here. Because knowledge is driving that result. Participation helps close the gap among the poorest and and Muslims and SCs and STs, all of these categories. The rich have defected from public sphere, and it's not grammatically right here, you could call it subversion of citizenship. They don't need citizenship to get the goods that they want. Services are unequally distributed across class and caste, but not religion. This is, in my view, someone who studied in the Muslim relations and Muslims in many parts of India, this is a very interesting and encouraging result. Muslims of Bangalore are different from Muslims of Hyderabad, Muslims of Aligarh, Muslims of Ahmedabad, etc. My prediction is that Muslims of Kerala cities would be still better off. That's my prediction. We will see when we get to those cities. Citizenship matters more for the poor, as we showed you through our last model, right? And there's only 1% chance, according to statistical thinking, that's wrong. And that, in other words, means that citizenship does abate class, even in India. That was an argument that Marshall made for Britain. That argument holds here even when we change the way citizenship is conceptualized and measured. Thank you.
The measurement of citizenship itself. Before we even look at the service delivery relationship, just within the measurement of citizenship itself, there are lots of takeaways. The difference, for example, between vertical and horizontal, the difference between different castes and religions, and so on. So there's a lot of things that they've laid out specifically within the domain of measuring citizenship itself, and there's lots of things for us to learn. And then the second part of the presentation has been about the relationship between citizenship and access to services, in which the most significant is the fact that citizenship matters more to the poor. And as in the last few slides we've heard that this is statistically significant So there's a lot to digest. In 1 hour, they've laid out a lot. So we could throw it open if Katie can also join that group. You wanna? And there are two, by the way, there are in your kits, there are actually, interestingly, and I think this is a first, there are 2 reports that you have. There's one report which is the pure academic report, which lays out all of the data, the tables, the questionnaires, and so on. And that has its own merit. And as Ashu said, what we hope will happen is the publication of at least 2, if not more, research papers. But we also hope to do a lot of quasi-academic publications, and that we will do collaboratively. There's a second report as well, which is the practitioner's report, which takes the same data and the same analysis, but looks at it from the perspective of Janaagraha and to say, what do we do with all of this? Because obviously while it's important to get regressions and statistical data and so on, what we care about is what does it mean on the ground with respect to either the work we do or, importantly, the role of government. And do they need to do more to encourage more citizenship, to encourage greater levels of both knowledge as well as participation. The part that has not been converted into any indices is the engagement part, the third pillar of the hypothesis around the construction of citizenship. There's a lot more work to be done, and we hope that as we proceed on this, we will do some of that as well. So there's a lot. Both the documents are with you, and with that, Ashu, you want to moderate this?
Yeah, so any questions that come to your mind? Any clarifications, clarificatory questions, critical comments? Yes, could you also introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Madalasa. I'm from the IMB Real Estate Research Initiative. So first off, congrats on pulling this off. This looks like an amazing piece of work and the kind of thing where you think you probably would like to have been involved with. Okay, so yeah, my question is on the BSDII versus housing.
Let's give you a microphone. Oh, you have it?
I don't think it's working, but I can just face my voice. I'm okay with it.
All right.
Okay, so on the BSDII versus housing, which I think was the second last slide before the citizenship index came up, I think there's a little bit of this thing on the private versus the public. I mean, upper class households have roads, they have sanitation, they have infrastructure, they have water, stuff like that, which is already provided by the private developers, right? So if you live in a place like, the class 5 household, which you're referring to, which is probably like the Raheja Arcade, the Brigade Gateway and stuff, you have a lot of this which is provided by your private developer. So in some sense, the split up of what is provided by the public infrastructure person, the BDA, the BBMP, the BWSSP, versus what is being provided by the private developer is probably something which will add value. And that's just a comment. The second one, it probably has a slight degree of indigeneity. And this I say because when I buy a house in an upper class neighborhood, I'm buying it because I'm assured of sanitation, not having to run after, water is obviously taken off the thing, because you could have a tanker which is providing you water. But I essentially don't have to worry about a lot of these services because they have been taken care of. The locality is quite well developed, which is why it is upper class. So going back and asking the same people what the quality of service which is being provided to them probably has a slight degree of indigeneity. These two are my comments. And the third one, which is to do with the degree of participation. I think in Bangalore, at least, I'm not aware of the other states, but they have a lot of the citizens in the upper class, like the Ugly Indians and so many forums where, the upper class is open, but may not be in the same structure in which the questions have been asked. If you're looking at involvement in social media, if you're looking at the number of forums which are there, I don't know whether you need to consider it, but I think that would not be a bad idea.
Could you explain a bit more at this point, the last point?
Okay, I think you can ask the rest of the people in the forum as well.
I think she means, if I understand you, you need to ask questions about alternative forms of engagement like social media and online platforms, which could give you a higher score for
higher response. So the difference that you're seeing by class It may not be the traditional forms of response like going and sitting in an area sabha, but it may be through other things like probably going to I paid a bribe, I changed my city, stuff like that. And you just have to look at some of the social forums which are there on Facebook, and I think they are amazing in terms of bringing up these kinds of things to the fore. I think that's something which probably, you could look at a later point in time. Thank you.
Thank you.
So,
Madhu.
Madhu, the one of the ways, at least the way in which we identified household structures was primarily to look at the type of construction. Okay, what kind of materials were they using? What kind of roofs did they have? And so on. So we didn't use indicators such as road or sanitation to measure housing type. So in that sense, the measurement of the dependent variable, which is service delivery and infrastructure, is distinct from how we measure the housing type itself, right? So that's the first one. So there was no kind of conflation of the two. The second part is that if you look at the distinction between, so yes, in the construction of the index, whether your water came from a private source or a public source were indicators of level of service delivery. Okay? The other thing is, if you look at the outer wards, for example, they have very poor levels of public provision of services. A lot of the services they receive is in fact private, right? And people still go and purchase homes and much of the gated communities that exist are in the outer areas of Bangalore, not in the inner cities, right? And we find that these outer areas are serviced with relatively poor levels of basic services and infrastructure. And social media alternative forms of...
Yeah, I mean, we didn't measure that. It's problematic because the sociological literature actually argues that there's a correlation between increased engagement in the internet and decreased overall participation. So Robert Putnam, Theda Scotchball, there's a huge literature on this. So, and it's not entirely clear that going online, I mean, obviously it can be useful in terms of participating in the public sphere, but is it a form of participation in the sense that we traditionally use the word participation? And participation is about cooperating with other people in face-to-face interactions. And we know from the experimental literature that when you try to solve problems on the internet, people are much more egotistical than likely to cooperate. Whereas if you have face-to-face interactions, you're much more likely to be a conditional cooperator than an egotistical actor. So theoretically, it's a little difficult to figure out exactly how you would bring participation in social media into a measure of participation as traditionally defined. But maybe we need to go beyond the traditional definition.
I can tell you how Robert Putnam handled this problem. And or what his results were. So he has a famous essay, and then I think that was titled the book also, Bowling Alone, right? And he argued that with the rise of the television age itself, right? He said this social media comes later. The forms of cooperation that existed between human beings in America, the claim was about America. America was described by Tocqueville as a nation of joiners. The term was joiners, a nation of joiners. And somewhere around the mid-1960s, it began to drift away from that, and it became a nation that bowled alone, right? So and you can take this towards the social media point, where perhaps you might have to argue with Putnam. We will think about this. It's a very interesting suggestion you're making. Perhaps we can, if we think like Putnam, if we come to the view that Putnam is right, seems like he is, but we'll think about that, then the person who participates a lot on the social media is not necessarily a cooperator. is probably a very egotistical individual and expressing his interest or her interest in a very egotistical manner. Now, some forms of cooperation might still emerge, not to deny that. Some, for example, a lot of protest currently in the United States over racial abuse of the police has been organized through Facebook and Twitter. A lot of that protest. And organizing so many people in a protest, right, is a classic form of participation. So in the classic literature on participation, protest and demonstration played a very important role. Now, if through Twitter and Facebook you can do that, then social media also can play a role in inducing cooperation, even when we think that its predominant form is of egotistical individuals exchanging.
Can I just add one more point about indigeneity? It's something we've really thought about and tried to work through. Now, if you're saying that citizenship and public service delivery are endogenous, we make the claim that citizenship, levels of knowledge, levels of participation occur prior to the kinds of services you receive. Of course, the one way of really addressing this is using instrumental variables, and that's always a relatively tough task, right? The second thing is that thinking about indigeneity, I think maybe we could have a greater discussion about this after this panel. So,
Jessica?
So on this point about the types of engagement, I mean, I think what struck me here is that when you're looking at the role of social media versus
The microphone, do you have?
No, but so what's missing in here is there seems to be underlying in the report this idea that you have a state that is essentially capable of providing these services, but won't, or doesn't necessarily always do this. But it doesn't necessarily always provide, but it could. And what it needs is some degree of kind of strategic direction, perhaps coming from the consultations or areas of it. It also needs a bit of a fire alarm, so people coming and the types of engagement that you mentioned, having gone to the state to demand your rights. And I think what that misses, especially in an Indian context, is that sometimes the middle capability of the state to deliver, say, inclusive mobility, to plan its bus routes in a way that actually reach particular areas, to notice where is water leaking from the distribution network, where are the tankers going astray, and things like that, that are basically a capacity to see and respond to information. That's sometimes missing, and that's a form of engagement. And if you want to go back to the basic forms of citizenship, of co-creation of spaces and collaboration, that's where some of these forms of social media, beyond the Facebook groups and things, but these kinds of social media and technology-enabled interventions that aggregate a different view of the city. Things like that data drive that bring to light new facts, new features of the city that the state may not know, that identify the difference in where are the slums versus what the state knows about the slums. And I don't think necessarily destroys, it's a different form of collaboration. I'm not sure that these theories about face-to-face versus technology are really capable of doing that. And particularly when you're looking at production of infrastructure and services, I think you have to look at the very granular places for where citizen-generated information could make a big difference. Where having citizens have some degree of almost statistical agency, the ability to represent their world in a way that the state is capable of processing, can be very powerful forms of engagement, and it would be nice to understand those.
So, Jessica, those of you who couldn't hear her at the back, is basically saying, I'm not famous for being a soft speaker. So, the point basically is, Jessica's point is that the birth of social media and its increasing usage for certain kinds of activities might be citizenship enhancing. And I think it has to be taken seriously. In what ways is citizenship mitigating or reducing? In what ways is citizenship enhancing? Is a question that needs to be engaged. It's a difficult question, but that needs to be engaged, undoubtedly, as we move forward. And this will be a form in which a lot of millions of people are going to express themselves. This is the form it will take, and what exactly it does to citizenship has to be thought through. Right? We don't have a quick answer. Shall we go to you?
It's a great presentation. Lots of stuff here that I'm reflecting on this comparatively from the work that I do in Delhi. And
let's see whether you can this work.
What's happening with the mic?
Okay, so 3 points here. When you choose housing type, great, comes very close as a proxy to class, but gets in a little less of the practice that you promise of citizenship taking on the Summers way. And I think here I would agree with the previous commentator, Jessica, that got her name then. For example, in Delhi, the use of the mobile phone, the use of the metro, and the wearing of jeans and t-shirts by even those who live in segregated dwellings on the urban periphery, that's kind of allowing them to enter the portals of anonymous universal citizenship and leave behind markers of identity that were holding them back from participation in the arena of the universal citizenship that Delhi promises so much more as a territorial site of national power. So my first point is that I've seen much less of the practice that you indeed did promise, but then I didn't see much of it. The second one, on the engagement part, how the citizen engages with the state. Our findings in Delhi have been that for your BSDI, which I think is an index with a lot of promise for comparative work in India, the citizens in Delhi, and when I say citizens, I'm looking at the urban marginal, the urban poor, special focus on them, are relying a lot more on the state government to deliver the BSDI than they are on the civic authorities. So however much of a direct election we have for them, in a sense, there is a substantive understanding of hierarchy, even amongst the urban marginal and the urban poor. They understand hierarchy to be meaningful, and that can be twisted around. A lot of discrimination, therefore, could be a merger of old and new types of practice of hierarchy that we can come to later, especially when I present at the end. The third part on political participation, sure, the poor people are voting, stamping with their feet. The women who you think do not know, feign that they do not know, but signal at the end about what they're going to do. And that was one of the reasons why the Aam Aadmi Party made absolutely glorious victories amongst the urban poor, because the women at the end of an hour-long ethnographic interviews would just be coming out at the doorstep and showing us the drain that was stinking and saying, can you look at this? Government needs to do this. Didi, this time don't forget the child. So the women were signaling, they were feigning ignorance. However, even voting with their feet, women feigning ignorance yet coming out to vote, it's not changing out the BSDI as much as it should have. So whether the political participation, high levels of political participation are creating the conditions for change of civic engagement and of making a claim back on the state from the poor especially, that remains a question mark.
Patrick has worked on Delhi much more systematically than I have, so he will answer the first two. But on the third point, our claim is not that greater participation or greater knowledge on the part of the poor would get them as high or got them as high a level of service delivery as the rich got. That's not what we claim. We simply said that without that participation, they would get less, even less. That's a different kind of claim. These are two analytically separable claims, right? So the women, the poor women who showed you the stinking drain, right? Now, perhaps something could be done there because of that participation, but that area would not look like Rasan Vihar, right? So these are two analytically separable claims. And on the first two, local government versus the engagement in jeans and metro, Patrick has spent a lot of time.
Well, I want to focus on Bangalore since that's the data we presented. And I mean, Manisha, you're right. The way we present this, there's not a lot about the practice of citizenship per se, but that's what the indicators are trying to capture as best as one can use quantitative indicators to capture what is fundamentally a relational dynamic. So ideally, we want to backstop all of this with more qualitative research, and that's one of the things we're hoping to do. But having said that, we didn't report it here, but both for the engagement measure and a series of questions we asked about discrimination, rather than ask people if there's discrimination or ask them about their experience of engaging the state, we asked a series of questions about the nature of their engagement. So we took them through scenarios, etc. So when you went to the water department with a complaint, who did you go with? Who did you talk to? What did you do? How were you treated, etc. And for us, that's the best way to capture practice. Right? I mean, if you ask people, and we know this for discrimination, for example, if you ask people about discrimination in the survey data, they generally underreport discrimination. When you put them in focus groups, much higher levels of reporting of discrimination. So again, for the discrimination questions, which we did not report here, we didn't ask, again, are you discriminating? We asked about a set of practices. That was our way of measuring it. So maybe it doesn't come out in the presentation, but we did try to operationalize this idea of citizenship not just as a static bundle of rights, but citizenship as a set of practices. As to your point on service delivery at the state level, I think that's exactly right, and it shows up in our data. I mean, people vote equally at all three levels, local, state, and national. But when you ask them about their knowledge of local, the corporator, ward committees, only 35% can name their corporator, 93% don't even know there are ward committees. And so we actually say in the report that there's a tremendous amount of confusion given the hierarchical and extremely fragmented nature of service delivery in Indian cities. I mean, in Brazilian and South African cities, everyone knows who delivers. It's the city government. In most cities in the world, it's city governments that deliver services. In India, you have this three-tiered system that creates a lot of confusion, but it is a hierarchical system. And this is why MLAs are much more important than councillors. And I would argue that that's part of the governance problem and challenge.
Can I just add one quick point on the instrumental value of citizenship? One of the things that we cannot test with just the first set of data that we've got is the lag effect. Because obviously there is an intrinsic value to citizenship, but then there is, I think, the hypothesis that higher levels of citizenship can contemporaneously result in higher levels of service delivery would be a stretch argument. So this can only be validated through longitudinal studies. So part of what we need to do is to create panel data and track this systematically, which is to say, we'd like to see higher levels of citizenship as an intrinsic good, but if we really want to measure the relationship between this higher level of citizenship resulting in higher levels of service delivery, our hypothesis must include some presumptions about lag effects.
I'm Vinod, I teach in the Department of Political Science, Bangalore University. A pleasure to be here, but just a few general observations. One, the whole question of how we look at participation itself. That's extremely important. But generally, we tend to link participation with the sense of public ownership. That I think is really important. The reality of unequal participation, I think, is democracy's unresolved dilemma. This is a reality in all democracies, question of degree, more or less. I think the question is not so much who participates. I think the question is whether one possesses the characteristics to participate meaningfully. That's where the issue that was raised earlier by the young lady about social capital, I think. Cultural capital, I think is very, very significant. Now, you did raise the whole question of engaging in the state institutions. I think my gut feeling is that in the whole process of formally trying to look at the ground realities, perhaps there is this possibility of ignoring many indicators, positive indicators, that reflect out of the larger social cultural milieu. And that's extremely important. So my sense is there is in the Indian context, probably in the context of Bangalore city itself, I see a large number of people who participate. Even in terms of procuring services from the state. But perhaps they do not necessarily participate formally. I mean, there are a host of intermediaries, for example, who facilitate that participatory process, which sometimes we overlook in the whole process of identifying some of these issues. Because, it maybe because of illiteracy, maybe because of social cultural realities, economic indicators, various kinds. So this dimension probably also has to be factored in, which may not be visible, but I think is definitely a reality also. Secondly, I think also you need to look at the whole reality of the floating, population in Bangalore, which is so high. How do you factor in this floating population? They are part of the urban space. They actively participate. They are also challenged for the policymakers in so many different ways, but they are very much there. How do you factor in the floating population? How do you also look at the whole question of migratory population? I mean, Bangalore city is, I think, a city that the demography cannot be really, I think, comprehended without looking at the interstate and intrastate migrations. And the last point basically is the whole question of many of those indicators that you raised pertaining to class, caste, religion. I still haven't read your report entirely, but my sense is many of those arguments that you brought up in terms of these indicators perhaps would be replicated in many Indian cities too, not necessarily in Bangalore alone.
Our survey and our data actually showed that there was a correlation between the older residents of Bangalore as versus the newer residents of Bangalore. And it seemed to suggest that there seemed to be a greater sense of participation and citizenship simply by that very factor, the greatest sense of greater ownership. Is there a reason why we didn't add that as a conclusion? Was it not strong enough to bring in as a conclusion? Is that why we didn't add it?
Well, it doesn't have an effect on service delivery. So whether the household respondent is a migrant or whether he or she has lived in Bangalore for a significant period of time doesn't have an effect on whether the household gets higher or lower services. But yes, it does have a relationship with citizenship. Typically, we find that residents exhibit higher levels of knowledge compared to non-residents. They also tend to exhibit higher levels of participation compared to non-residents. So yeah, absolutely, but not with service delivery.
I'm a sociologist, and we have a lot of concerns with the way the concept of social capital has been constructed. It was originally generated by a French sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu, to describe exclusion. And then it got reappropriated by certain academics and then the World Bank as this, fuzzy, warm community thing. And the problem is that social networks could be inclusive and they could be exclusionary. And so there's a huge measurement problem with the very idea of social capital. We do have a series of questions that capture community capacity for collective engagement. And at a community level, engaging in order to secure public goods is, for me, clearly an instance of participation. Whether I would call it social capital or not, I hesitate, because the way in which the term social capital has often been used, it in effect depoliticizes the concept of social capital. Whereas I think you have to think of it as a politically constructed phenomenon. Communities that have the kind of social capital that allows them to make their claim making more efficient are communities that are organized, and it's very political. So in any event, I think it's a tricky set of questions, an important set of questions, but we didn't unfortunately report the community questions, in part because we haven't had enough time to disaggregate them. But it's very clear that the urban poor, as communities, organize collectively much more than other communities. And again, in the Indian context, that's not entirely surprising, but it's not something we can take for granted. Because in many other contexts, and the US is the most obvious one, that's not true at all. So this is something that we need to explain. On the floating population, we say it in the report, we didn't say it in the presentation. We, for all intents and purposes, excluded the floating population from the sample for the very simple reason that we wanted to ask primarily about their access to services. And floating populations, insofar as they don't have a permanent form of residence, etc., obviously have very problematic relationships to services. We can't tell you what percentage of our sample immigrated within the last year, but we didn't include migrating within the last year in the overall sample because of this obvious problem that almost by definition they're going to have problematic access to services. And then on migration, I would just add that migration is here, it's in the models, it turns out not to be an explanatory factor for services. It is for citizenship, but I just want to point out that we found that 52% of migrants are forward cast. And this is important to emphasize, right? I mean, the image of migrants is invariably the construction worker, the unskilled worker coming and living in slums, but especially in today's interconnected global cities of India economy, there's a tremendous amount of elite migration across cities. So it's not entirely clear that migrants as a total category are less well integrated into the city. And so we really want to differentiate that category.
Yeah. On social capital, the current state of knowledge would say the following. What is more important for a whole range of outcomes, not all, or a whole range of concerns, is not how much social capital, but at what time. Right? And you could say in that type how much, that's a separate issue, right? But not how much aggregate social capital. So Putnam started the argument about what 15 years ago, about a dark side of social capital, and then developed that further to make a distinction, draw a distinction on which my last book heavily relies, on that distinction between bonding social capital and bridging social capital. So the connections within the community, defined ethnically, racially, caste-wise, right? And religion-wise, right? And connections across those boundaries, across Hindu and Muslim boundaries, across caste boundaries, across linguistic boundaries, etc. Right? And they have very different effects, right? So therefore, trying to ask a question about social capital in today's survey research is generally not viewed as interesting as trying to ask questions about the kind of social capital that might exist, assuming social capital is theoretically important for your work. Right? Only so many questions can go in. Now, what was important for us was to figure out how do the poor organize, right? Do they organize and on what issues, right? And that is there in the report you'll find. And if not, that's and we've not been able to put that in the report. It's certainly something in the survey, right? But kind of social capital has become a much more important issue in the last 10 years than social capital per se. Yeah.
I think it's very different. What I'm trying to ask is, what drives service delivery? Is it the leadership or the citizens' asks? See, when you say that the rich is not really participating enough, it may not be required. Maybe they're already having. So my question is, that means the cities which are well provided for, the service delivery is excellent, everything is going smooth. So there is no need for citizen partnership, or they do not participate, or because there are a lot of poor people here, there is more need for. I just wanted a little bit of analysis on, because I have found that people who are decently provided for, they feel that it's fine and they don't sort of participate so much. So that's my question. What drives to go to the next level?
No, I think that's a really important question, and just a larger point that goes back to Jessica's earlier question, and then a specific comment on your question about participation. The larger point, I don't think it's an either-or. It's never an either-or story. There has to be a demand-side dynamic, there has to be a supply-side dynamic. And by and large, we're not looking at what drives the supply-side dynamic. We've got some proximate measures of what that supply-side dynamic looks like. So for instance, ward committees. The state could could and should create ward committees, and that would transform the nature of participation. It would make it a lot easier for the urban poor and those who don't have access to the internet to have a point of interface with the state. We know that the state in Bangalore, the state, has not done a very good job of constructing those arenas. So that's a supply side dynamic. And then yes, you could make the bureaucracies more efficient at delivery. In the practitioner's version of the report, there's this astonishing table. Devesh Kapoor always says that the Indian state is the most bureaucratized and the least staffed. And case in point, in the practitioner's report, the city of Durban, which has levels of inequality that rival any Indian city with the legacy of apartheid. It's a big city, it's 4 million plus now, much higher levels of inequality than Indian cities. They have 10 more public employees per capita than Bangalore does. So there's a massive supply side problem, there's no doubt.
10 times.
10 times more, what did I say?
10 more.
Oh, 10 more, 10 times more, all right? 10 times more engineers, 10 times more community activists who work on behalf of the planning board, etc. So certainly the supply side equation is a huge part of the story. Here our concern was largely to try and capture the demand side equation. And then on participation, I mean, yes, it would seem logical that if people are satisfied, they participate less. But the comparative record shows exactly the opposite. The highest levels of community and political participation in the world are in social democratic countries. The Swedens and the Norways and the Denmarks, which have excellent cradle-to-grave public services, and where the level of participation in association and politics is much higher than, say, in the Anglo-Saxon countries that have, comparatively quite poor services. To compare India to a more comparable country, Brazil. So Brazil today, in terms of human social development indicators, in terms of basic services, sewage, education, healthcare, very high levels of provision that have improved dramatically. And what are they doing? They're protesting. They protested against the World Cup. Brazilians protesting against soccer and demanding what? Public goods. And demanding it in the name of their rights. So if anything, the fact that they get more has in turn enhanced their capability for claim making. And it goes back to the point that citizenship in and of itself is intrinsically important.
Yeah, we have several.
I think I've been waiting.
So shall we take 4 or 5 questions? Yeah, let's go to you at the back.
Someone here will be putting his hand up.
Okay, Suraj, yeah.
I'm Ritika from Jain University.
Okay.
And since I've had the advantage of being involved in the initial discussions of CI for this report, I'm really excited to now see the findings. My question is that the first CI report reported that higher civic literacy leads to higher civic engagement, and technically how this report is constructed, it goes one step further, saying that it also leads to higher service delivery eventually. But then if higher civic knowledge or literacy if that is really a linear progression, saying that higher civic knowledge would lead to engagement, would lead to service delivery, then these discrepancies or discriminations or differences of poor, Muslims, religion, caste, etc., how would they fall into place in having a less or a more civic engagement if the progression would really be as linear as more knowledge, more engagement, and more service delivery? So where do these differences then start to blur, and the only driving factor would perhaps be higher knowledge, higher literacy, higher engagement, leading to actual service delivery?
Quality of publicly available services varies across Bangalore. So for example, where I stay in Bangalore, when I moved in, I had a choice of 2 or 3 different places I could get a gas cylinder from. And everybody said, go there, don't go there. Now it could be that could, so for example, if I were dealing with a place where I knew it was hopeless, then maybe my reaction would be not to participate in demand, but to vote with my feet, move elsewhere. On the other hand, if it is in some kind of middle range, where I think going and demanding might make a difference, it might matter. Why this could, in other words, why the variation in this quality of supply across Bangalore could potentially undermine some of these results is that it's an endogeneity problem. Because this could both simultaneously affect participation. I see the state is useless for something, I stop participating. Something similar and analogous in the employment literature, right? I'm unemployed so long, I stop looking for work, so I'm no longer unemployed. So, so it could affect both participation and delivery. So that could protect. Now, I don't know how serious it is, but I'm told anecdotally that government schools in Bangalore vary quite a bit. So there are Kannada schools, Tamil schools, Urdu schools, even among Kannada schools, and so on. So this could, so at the least, there should be a robustness testing of the results. I have a couple of other quick comments. So the way, Ashutosh, you set it up conceptually with SEN and capabilities and all that, it's sort of the positive liberty angle of SEN and not the negative liberty angle, which is, should we not be interested in the state not harassing people, right? So I was told by a neighbor who runs an ice cream parlor somewhere that a policeman regularly comes and says, you can't open beyond 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock or something. And so it's just a matter of bribing, right? So this is not the sort of service delivery you're looking at. So that is purely negative liberty, right? So citizenship should be also about bundles of rights and practices of not being harassed. Now, so clearly you've taken a stance of the capabilities style. So is there a reason you didn't go with the whole territory of negative liberty and state harassment and the things around it? So that's another question. A third quick question has to do with class. So clearly class plays a big role in many of your things. And I think it's a very cool, clever way of getting at class by the housing type. But I don't know how many of these people are renters versus owners. And the reason I ask that is, it is possible that there is far less mobility for owners than renters. And so as a renter, I might decide to rent something which is slightly higher than my income level or slightly lower. So there would, I don't know how much discrepancy might be there between conceptual notions of class and housing type based on renters versus owners. Now, there are people who own who are much richer than the neighborhood they stay in because for various heritage and other reasons they stay put, right? So I would like to see if your results are robust to subsamples of renters versus owners as you define the class. That would be an easy way of getting rid of this problem. But I don't know. So this is not the same as the floating population, right? So there could be renters who are, there are people who have lived in Bangalore for 30 years but rent. Now, okay. Very last question. This question came up earlier. So the second bullet that you have up there, right, about participation being a partial leveler rather than a full leveler, right? So partially closes the gap. Now to say that, so this interpretation depends upon the size and not the sign of your coefficient. So to say that it closes the gap partially is about the sign. How much depends on the size. And if I remember, you got 0.2, 0.3 were the coefficients for your interaction terms. Right? Now, is it big enough to say it somewhat closes or it very tinily closes? Right? So it's a matter of the analytical distinction is important enough to focus on the size. And this seems like a technical point, but I think you're making a big claim in the conclusion, sort of assuming that the size is reasonable enough to say that sign translates into size. But it's very well known with the sample of the power of the sample that you have, that you could have 3 stars with very tiny size. So I'd like to know what 0.2 in your interaction means in terms of how big or small is the closing of the gap.
These comments are going to be extremely helpful as we proceed further, undoubtedly. Size of the closing, so 3 stars, but that shows significance. But what is the size? What is the magnitude? And that I think we need to engage that question. I understand negative and positive liberty somewhat differently. We can talk about it. Perhaps Isaiah Berlin's paper, Two Concepts of Liberty, has been discussed more than any other political theory paper ever written, some people say. So there's a lot of discussion about negative versus positive. But surely not being harassed by the state, whether we call it negative or positive, not being harassed by the state has to be a part of citizenship measurement as a concept. That there won't be a dispute with that. And then what else is here? Higher literacy, higher participation. I think statistically, Siddharth has handled it, so he will probably answer that. Those are my closing remarks. These are very, very important comments that we've received, and they will guide us further.
Those are terrific questions. Thank you. On the negative dimensions of state power and how that comes into definitions of citizenship, we do ask about the police. So we've got some data. We couldn't do a lot with it, and we do ask about discrimination. We asked a whole range of questions about discrimination, and we spent a lot of time going through all the survey literature on discrimination, figuring out how to measure it. And I have to confess that either the story is that there's very little discrimination in Bangalore, or we just failed to capture it. Because what we found is that the people who report the most discrimination are the most educated. And there's an obvious problem with that. So your point's well taken, but we're happy enough to just be able to do the positive side of capabilities at this point, and then someone else could do this kind of survey work on the negative dimensions of citizenship. And then to your questions about mobility, we actually do know whether people have moved recently. And again, that's just another part of the data set that we haven't fully mined. So with your questions in mind, we'll definitely be doing that. But the other thing that we want to do is a lot more spatial analysis. Because I think you're right. I think housing type is a proxy for class, but it's also a proxy for space. And different places in the city have different, for historical and legal and institutional reasons, have different levels of service delivery. And that's probably what's driving a lot of this, but until we do the disaggregated spatial analysis, we can't speak to that.
I think partially the service delivery index also captures quality. It's not just whether you receive water or not, it's how often do you receive water, what's the duration of power cuts, is the water usable for dual purposes, for drinking as well and for other things. So maybe it might be useful to disaggregate those and use one as the quality measure. But yeah, quality might be affecting both levels as well as whether you want to participate or not. So that's certainly open for testing, and I think we should do it. So thanks for that. The other question on the size of the coefficient, we find that when we disaggregate the participation, so right now what we presented is an aggregate of both the knowledge as well as the participation. So the index, the citizenship index, combines both knowledge as well as participation. But what this refers to here is when you look at the crosstabs, we see that there are great differences in knowledge levels, but when you look at participation, it seems to bridge both gender for different genders, as well as for, let's say, Dalit communities or Muslim communities that show large differences in knowledge, but when it comes to participation, they tend to catch up with the other groups. So this comment is more drawn from the crosstabs, but we haven't really done the testing. We have, but we haven't presented the results. But clearly we observed that the interaction between participation and class has a much larger effect on service delivery than between knowledge and relative to the interaction between knowledge and class. So the effects of participation seem to be much higher than the effects of knowledge. But we can go through the results, in greater detail and but in the aggregate, the result does kind of show up as relatively small. The average is only 0.28. That's the size of the coefficient.
And with participation alone, it could go up to 0.4, 0.5?
I'm not sure. I don't want to. I have to.
It has to be larger. The sheer logic of the situation, of the way it's set up, right? Because participation is leveling. And therefore, the relationship of participation with service delivery, that relationship will be with 3 stars and higher magnitude. Almost certainly.
One last question. I came in late, and so I missed a portion of it. It's a large portion of the presentation, but I'm looking at the conclusions. Your conclusion says that urban poor have less citizenship and the rich have defected. So where is really citizenship most prevalent?
Middle class.
The middle class.
Lower middle class.
But lower middle class, do you see more prevalent in lower versus upper? Do you see a distinction?
If you're closing up, can I just make one quick observation on the last set of questions? That was fascinating. Just quick 30 seconds. Two of the four questions that you raised, I think one was related to levels of participation actually hiding signals about the willingness of the state to actually respond. And unless we test for that, we wouldn't know. I think that's a very, very important point. And as a practitioner, it's our belief, both for intrinsic value of citizenship as well as instrumental value of citizenship, that the state has an obligation to provide the space to participate. And if you don't provide the space to participate, the response that you will find is that many people would actually tend to step back. So igniting that sense of participation is an obligation of the state. And in fact, there are reports now in the UK and so on which say the definition of what the state ought to provide is actually going beyond just the mere provision of public goods, but actually enabling this sense of citizenship as well. So what we are seeing, I think it's a reasonable hypothesis, there's no data to test it, is yes, you have low levels of participation, but what's causing that? Is it the absence of the state willing to give you those opportunities? I think that's a very important element that needs to continue to get tested. The other is your coefficient point. And again, what we don't know yet is the longitudinal effect. What we are measuring is contemporaneous relationship between higher levels of citizenship and higher levels of service delivery. And what this is saying is that if you are poor, between poor who don't have higher levels of citizenship versus those who do, those who don't have higher levels of citizenship have lower levels of services. So that coefficient, as you rightly said, the size of the coefficient is as important as the statistical significance of it. But what we don't know is what is the longitudinal effect. Because as we all know, you can't claim citizenship and demand your rights and expect the state to respond. We have a sticky state with a lot of transmission losses, and we need to factor that in as well.